For 9 seconds, my heart stopped. 9 seconds where the line on the monitor went flat and the alarm blared a note of finality I wasn't ready to hear. When my eyes fluttered open again, it wasn't my sons I saw. It was a single, crisply folded piece of paper on the rolling tray next to my bed. The note said, "Off to the Bahamas for 10 days. Hope you're feeling better by the time we get back." That was it. No missed calls, no wilting flowers, no hand to squeeze, just an itinerary. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment saying where you're watching from. I felt hollowed out, a man held together by medical tape. A thin plastic band had bleached a pale stripe across the skin of my wrist. The back of my throat tasted of old pennies. The prongs of the oxygen cannula pulled at my nostrils every time I dared to draw a deep breath. I chose not to breathe deeply. A nurse moved with the quiet grace that all the best nurses seem to possess. His name tag read David, the plastic scuffed from 100 hurried shifts. He checked the drip of my IV, made a small adjustment to a tube, and told me to get some rest. He said I'd given them all quite a scare. I let my gaze drift toward the note and thought a sentence that would become my silent companion for weeks. Not all of them. He pulled the thin blanket up to my chest, tucking it in with the care of someone closing a book they didn't want to damage. Then he slipped back behind the curtain and the steady beep of the machine stepped forward to fill the space he'd left. I started counting the ceiling tiles, because numbers are clean and order is a comfort when the world has abandoned its own logic. 66 tiles in total. 2 were yellowed like old ivory, and 1 had a hairline fracture that veered away from the metal grid as if the ceiling itself had thought about splitting open but decided against it at the last second. I tried to recall the precise moment the darkness had folded in on me. I remembered the sensation just before, a dull thud deep in my chest like a heavy door closing at the end of a long, empty corridor, followed by the sound of footsteps walking away. A cool draft from a vent snaked across my skin. The ICU has a way of stretching time, pinning it down like a specimen under glass. Dawn arrived like a hand slowly lifting a window shade. The hallway beyond my room brightened. The scattered footsteps of the night shift gathered into the purposeful rhythm of the day. Voices rose and fell in soft, professional murmurs. A phlebotomist came in, tying a purple tourniquet around my arm and asking me to make a fist. Her words were soft and steady. "You're going to heal. It just might take more time than you'd like." The needle slid out. A cotton ball was pressed down, and for a fleeting moment, life felt manageable again. David returned with a small paper cup of water, his kindness a quiet presence that didn't demand answers. He placed the cup next to the folded note, as if they were 2 distant relatives forced to share a table at a funeral. He told me the doctor would be making his rounds soon, that my vitals were stabilizing. He asked if I wanted the blinds opened. I said yes. My voice was a dry rasp, like a foot dragging through gravel. He pulled the cord, and the morning sun poured in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden shafts of light, like memories that refused to settle. Below, the hospital grounds moved with a slow, deliberate pace. People walked with a sense of purpose that felt foreign and borrowed. The lawn beyond the main entrance was an unnaturally vibrant green for the tail end of winter, a colour coaxed into existence by sprinklers and a rigid schedule. When he left, the silence in the room returned, this time taking the shape of a silent visitor who sat in the chair by my bed and simply watched. My eyes found the note again. The handwriting was rushed. The fold was clean. There were no smudges from a hand that had paused, that had hesitated before leaving. I thought of all the notes I'd written for my boys on scraps of paper when they were young. "Be home by dinner. Don't forget your cleats. Good luck on the exam." I'd left those notes on the kitchen counter, tucked inside their lunchboxes, because words can hold your place in the world when you can't be there yourself. I thought about that as I stared at the small, bent piece of paper that pretended to be a stand-in for love. I tried to make a list in my head of what still mattered. Breathing in, breathing out, the metronomic beep of the machine that agreed to keep count with me. The persistent ache nestled between my ribs, an unwelcome tenant with no intention of paying rent, the coarse edge of the blanket scratching my elbow. A hospital is just a collection of small, persistent discomforts, a symphony of irritations designed to remind you that you are, in fact, still here. I accepted them one by one, like overdue bills on a table. Then I let my gaze drift. The plastic curve of the oxygen mask, my own face reflected in it, distorted and incomplete. I looked away before I had to concede how accurate it was. A chaplain stopped by, his voice soft, a clipboard in his hand. He asked if I wanted to talk. I told him I'd used up my words for the time being. He nodded and left a small card with a simple cross on it. It lay on the tray beside the vacation note. Two opposing ideas that couldn't find common ground. A woman with a discharge planning badge visited later, armed with a sheaf of pamphlets. Meal delivery, grab bars, in-home services. She asked about my family support system, her eyes on mine while her pen hovered over a checkbox on her form. I watched the pen make its mark. Patient indicates limited support at home. She laid a hand on my forearm and offered the same hollow sentence adults use when they want to give you more hope than they can carry themselves. You'll get through this. It just takes time. I thanked her because kindness still counts, even when it's constructed from pre-approved phrases. By evening, the wing settled into a different rhythm. Doors sighed shut. Carts rolled softly down the halls. The monitors held their quiet, coded conversations. The air conditioner exhaled at a steady rate, making the curtain by my bed tremble like an old man hesitating at the edge of a cold lake he once swam in as a boy. Around the corner, I heard David answer a phone in a hushed tone. He said my last name, followed by the word stabilized. He said conscious. He asked a question, paused, and then let out a sigh through his nose, a sound that told me he had just offered a bridge and had watched someone refuse to cross it. The phone clicked back into its cradle. The machines continued their one-note song. When I slept, images flickered through my mind like an old slide projector. A wooden dock on a grey lake, earthworms squirming in a coffee can, the lingering smell of gasoline on my fingers as I worked on the boat motor while the sun was still a rumour on the horizon. Helen was standing in the screen door, a smudge of flour on her cheek and a smile that could smooth out the roughest day. The antique compass her father gave me on our wedding day. She had pressed it into my hand and told me to navigate with love, not with fear. I had laughed and promised her I'd handle the boys and the mortgage and the leaky gutters and every other damn thing that tries to unmoor you if you look away for a season too long. I woke around 3 a.m. to a low alarm, which a nurse muted with practiced, gentle fingers. She adjusted a sensor on my chest and told me I was doing better than I probably felt. I chose to believe her because sometimes a stranger is the only one who can hand you a truth you don't have to pay for. She vanished as quickly as she appeared, pulled back by the relentless tide of hospital staffing. I lay there in the deep quiet that belongs only to empty hallways and vast, deserted parking lots. I looked at the chaplain's card with its cross, and I looked at the folded note from my sons, and I arranged them side by side in my mind. I didn't touch either one. My hands held more history than I could bear at that moment. Morning arrived, with a practical nurse pulling back the curtains and a respiratory therapist who looked like a swimmer who'd learned to hold his breath for other people. The cardiologist arrived with a small entourage and the professional habit of using the royal we. We are encouraged. We will continue to monitor. We expect a steady improvement. He said the numbers were looking better. He said I'd given everyone a scare. The expression on my face must have betrayed me because he glanced at the note on the tray. I just said, "Thank you." The words felt like a rare coin I still had in my pocket, one that no one had managed to take from me yet. They moved me to a different room, one with a window that offered a slice of sky. A thin, pink line stretched across the horizon, like a single thread pulled through a button, a stitch you hope will hold. I watched people in the parking lot below, moving with purpose, carrying coffees that steamed like small, forgiving storms. When you're sick, the world outside looks like a movie filmed at the wrong shutter speed. A driver opening a car door, a mother steadying her toddler's hand, a man in a suit checking his phone as if it owed him more time than it gave the rest of us. I wanted to be any of them because none of them had a note sitting on their bedside table that turned a father into a line item on a to-do list. David came in with a basin of warm water and helped me wash my face, the way a son helps his father when the years have made his hands less certain. He did it without a trace of pity. Pity is a coat that never fits right. He asked if I wanted to try sitting up. We moved slowly, the world tilting in a way that gave me a new respect for gravity, an old friend who always insists on having the last word. I sat, breathed, and waited for the dizziness to pass. He talked about the weather, as if the weather and I had important business to resume soon. It was a kindness that cost him nothing but bought me a minute of dignity. Later, a volunteer pushed a cart laden with worn paperbacks, small puzzles, and a bowl of peppermints in crackling red wrappers. She asked if I wanted a book. I told her I'd rather borrow a clock that ticked a little more slowly. She laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has heard sorrow dressed up as humour more times than she can count and still refuses to show it the door. She left a peppermint next to the note and told me I could have another if I got out of there before supper. I promised I'd do my best to beat her deadline. The day stretched on. A technician attached a new monitor to my chest, warning me that the adhesive might itch. "That's how you know you're living again," he said. Food arrived on a tray that was trying its best to be a meal. I pushed a fork into the green beans and ate because the body keeps its own ledger and doesn't care about your opinion of hospital cuisine. A janitor in blue scrubs came in and cleaned the floor in quiet, even strokes. He hummed a tune I couldn't place. He gave me a nod, the kind of workman's respect I recognized from decades on job sites. He had a job to do, and so did I, and we both did them like men who understood the cost of letting things slide. In the late afternoon, I asked David for a piece of paper. He asked if I was writing a letter. "I'm writing a list," I said. He brought a small notepad and a pen with a blue cap that clicked with a satisfying sound, reminding me of all the tedious board meetings I had endured and forgotten. On the top line, I wrote the simplest inventory I could think of. I wrote my name, the date, and the word breath. I added 3 more words below it: strength, honesty, time. I left a deliberate space between each word, as if the emptiness itself could act as mortar. I looked at the note from my sons. I copied the exact words they had written. "Off to the Bahamas for 10 days. Hope you're feeling better by the time we get back." I set the pen down and let the ink dry on the page. Sometime toward evening, the sky performed its quiet daily magic trick, softening the edges of the city into vague, gentle shapes. The parking lot lights flickered on one by one, like carefully considered thoughts. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of air being circulated by a machine that required no gratitude to continue its work. People talk about epiphanies as if they are loud, earth-shattering events like thunderstorms. Mine arrived quietly, like a man sitting down after realizing the argument he's been avoiding has already been settled without him. I wasn't going to ask for anything from the people who had left that note. I wasn't going to explain to them that fathers are the men who hold flashlights under cars, who wait in the bleachers on cold nights, who pretend not to hear when a boy's voice cracks because it's growing. I would not become a person who begged for basic human decency. I had a heart that had learned to find its rhythm again. I would keep my own time with that. An aide brought my evening medication in a small paper cup. The pills were the colour of a sidewalk after a rain. She checked my wristband and watched while I swallowed them. She smiled and told me that sleep is a kind of medicine they haven't figured out how to bill for yet. I told her I'd take as much of it as I could get. She left, and the room settled into a mood that belongs to televisions that have been turned off and children who have finally fallen asleep in the back seat on the long drive home. I stared at the note without blinking until my eyes began to water. Then I let a single tear fall, because salt is one way to measure loss, and because I've never believed that being a man meant you had to throw away the instruments that tell the truth. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and let the small embarrassment of the gesture pass through me and disappear into the bedsheet. It left no mark. Not all marks ask for permission to stay. Some are decent enough to leave on their own once you've learned what they came to teach you. There's a difference between being alone and being abandoned. Alone can be a choice. It can be a chair on a porch in the quiet blue hour after sunset with a mug that still holds some warmth. Abandonment is a subtraction, an act performed by others without your consent. I lay there and did the arithmetic. 9 seconds borrowed back from oblivion. One note that tried to turn a father into an afterthought. One nurse who kept calling me by my last name, as if the syllables themselves deserved respect. A city outside my window that had no idea I had slipped away and come back. The math didn't balance, but I understood the lesson anyway. You don't wait for people who have already practiced leaving. When the night nurse came to check my vitals, I asked if she could get me the compass that had made it to the hospital in a small plastic bag with my personal effects. She handed it to me gently, the way a granddaughter might hand a family heirloom to a grandfather she trusts to know its story. I pressed the cool metal against my palm, then against the tender spot over my sternum where the ache had pitched its tent. I opened the brass cover and listened to the subtle click, a sound that belonged to a life built on long shifts and quiet promises. The sound didn't fight with the beeping of the machines around me, it kept its own counsel. I understood that. Time is the only inheritance no one can sell out from under you unless you let them measure it for you. I slept better than I expected to. When I woke just before dawn, the room was filled with that pale, indecisive light that makes everything look temporary. The lines on the monitor traced their familiar small hills and valleys. The oxygen flowing through the cannula smelled less like a machine and more like simple air. David came in with a smile that suggested mornings were his favourite part of the day because they always proved the night wrong. He told me the doctor's rounds would be early. He asked if I wanted the blinds open. I nodded. He pulled the cord and put me back in the world. I asked him a question I hadn't planned on asking anyone. I asked him how long people usually stay angry before they decide to do something about it. He paused for a second, the way a person does when they know the answer isn't one size fits all. He said some men let anger become a chair they sit in until the cushion molds to their shape. Others stand up while the anger is still new and walk toward whatever isn't the chair. He quietly asked me which kind of man I thought I was. I told him I didn't know yet. He nodded, as if that in itself were a kind of knowing. Breakfast arrived under a plastic dome that tried to trap warmth but only succeeded in holding steam. I ate all of it because your body has filed a complaint and rules exist for a reason. Afterward, I picked up the note and held it in my hand. It didn't weigh much, most verdicts don't. They rely on cheap paper and the assumption that you'll do the heavy lifting for them. I set it down next to the chaplain's card and the peppermint I had saved like a foolish boy who still thinks a small piece of candy can fix a bad afternoon. I decided then that I would keep the note, not as proof for anyone else, but as a small compass that pointed away from where it came. The discharge planner returned with a new set of pamphlets, home health care, a transport service, a list of numbers to call if the stairs felt like a mountain range. She asked if someone would be at home to meet me. I told her the door knew my name, and for now, that would be enough. She looked like she wanted to argue, but then she thought better of it. She touched the back of my hand and said the softest words a stranger can say to another. "I'll write down what matters." She did, and when she left, the room felt lighter by the weight of one decent deed done without an audience. By the time they wheeled me to the elevator, the hospital halls had adopted that brisk, early afternoon pace. The scent of lemon cleaner couldn't quite mask the older smell of sickness and bleach. The elevator mirror showed me a man whose hair had thinned over the winter and who had learned a great deal about breathing. I didn't dislike him. He looked like the kind of man who would hire guys who needed a second chance and would stick to the payroll schedule even when cash flow was tight. My face held a line at the corner of my mouth that Helen used to press with her thumb when she wanted me to soften. It didn't soften. It didn't need to. The transport driver, a man named Leon, hummed a few bars of a song he couldn't remember the words to. He asked about a football game I no longer followed. I told him the score didn't matter to me the way it used to. He nodded like a man who had lost, found, and lost again. He drove gently over a pothole that the city had promised to fill last summer. The van's windows made the world look like a film from a different era. I watched the city pass by as if I were being reissued a license to notice it. We stopped at the pharmacy. The technician filled a white paper bag with prescription bottles that clicked against each other like loose teeth. I paid with a card and some cash, the different textures of them grounding me. Money isn't love, and it isn't respect, but sometimes it's proof that you exist in a world where someone has tried to write you out. Back in the van, I held the bag against my ribs like a small, trusting animal. Leon took a left, then a right, and the roads began to curve toward the neighborhood where I had shoveled snow, coached Little League, and taught a teenage boy how to drive a stick shift without burning out the clutch. As we turned onto my street, I felt a shift inside my chest that wasn't medical. The houses lined up like faithful, solid teeth. The porches faced the morning light as if expecting good news. The lawns were trying to be honest. The air had that clean edge it gets after a rain, even when there hasn't been any. Leon parked at the curb and came around to open the side door. He carried my bag to the porch, a man raised to consider the weight other people carry. He asked if I needed him to walk me inside. I told him I'd like to put my own hand on my doorknob. He nodded and stood back, watching without hovering. I won't cross that threshold just yet in this telling. That part of the story comes later, because that's where the house and I will have our first real conversation. For now, I'll end where this chapter was always meant to end. In a hospital bed, in a van, in the quiet space in between, with a folded note that tried to teach me what family means and failed, with a compass in my pocket, its needle steady, like a teacher who refuses to raise his voice, with the understanding that betrayal doesn't need a grand stage. It can do its work in a single sentence, set down and left behind, but it can also fail when a man chooses to let silence be a bridge and not a grave. If you're listening to this because you've stood where I've stood, I'll tell you the only lesson worth carrying out of a room full of machines. Don't trade your dignity for an apology that was never written for you. Take your breath, take your time, take the paper they left you and decide what you'll build with it. Some men crumble it, some men frame it. I placed mine in a book that will never be burned, and I turned the page. The first sound my house made wasn't a creaking floorboard or a groaning pipe. It was the quiet ticking of the compass case against my shirt as Leon's transport van pulled away from the curb. It felt heavier than it used to, the way a familiar tool feels different after a long winter away from your hands. I pressed my palm against it, the cool metal a steady presence, and for a moment I wasn't a man with the ghost of medical tape on his arms. I was back in a kitchen painted a shade of yellow that Helen had insisted made mornings kinder. She was standing by the window, pushing the compass into my hand, tilting her head in that way she did when she wanted a promise to stick. "Take care of them, Arthur," she'd said, the sentence carrying a double meaning. "Protect them and raise them, guard them and help them grow." I remember telling her I understood the difference, that I wouldn't confuse providing for them with parenting them. She'd smiled, the kind of smile a person gives when they deeply hope you're right. The porch smelled of damp oak, though it hadn't seen rain in weeks. I stood for a moment on the top step, both hands on the railing, letting my breath move in and out without making a production of it. Men my age learn to treat breathing with a certain respect. The spare key used to be in a ceramic turtle under the planter. That turtle had watched two boys race their bikes down the driveway, a woman carry in groceries, and a man fix a loose shutter in a downpour. When I reached into the hollow where its shell used to hide a small circle of brass, my fingers found only empty space. I've known worse kinds of emptiness, but I felt this one just the same. The front door was unlocked. The main lock turned, but the deadbolt hadn't been thrown. Liam hadn't bothered to secure it from the inside when he'd left. The house seemed to exhale as I stepped over the threshold. Homes breathe. You can hear it in the way old wood settles and ductwork clears its throat when the furnace kicks on. This breath was different. It smelled of new paint trying to pass as possibility, but it failed because the truth of what lay underneath refused to be covered up. I set the pharmacy bag on the entryway table and placed the compass beside it, a silent declaration to the house that we would be speaking plainly. Afternoon light cut across the floor in long, honest rectangles, finding dust the way old friends find you at a funeral. The living room rug had been vacuumed in obsessively straight lines. The sofa was pushed against the wall at an angle that made no sense for living, only for showing. It faced a blank wall that had been painted a colour with a name you read on a paint chip and immediately forget. Winter Sky, maybe, or Dove Grey. Names that try to turn air into a commodity. I took it in piece by piece. The house was a polite lie. New throw pillows that had never known a human head. A blanket draped with a stylist's calculated nonchalance. The coffee table was wiped clean of water rings and history. And on a sideboard by the window, a stack of picture frames was turned face down. I picked up the top one, feeling the glass shift under my fingers. The frame was simple, dark wood, the way Helen liked things that didn't apologize for being ordinary. When I turned it over, a diagonal crack ran from the bottom right corner to the top left, a sharp white line cutting across a younger man's face and a woman whose eyes caught the light like clear water. Our wedding photo, not on a wall, in a pile. A person could spend all day inventing metaphors, but this one didn't need any help. Sometimes a crack is just a crack, and sometimes it's a closing statement. There are moments you handle like fragile glass, and there are moments you have to put down because your hands aren't strong enough and your pride has finally learned to stop pretending. I set the frame back on the stack, my fingers resting on it for a second. It wasn't a prayer, it was just a habit, a way of saying, I see you and I still know your name. I looked around and saw the empty space where the large painting of the lake had hung for 20 years. The wall held its pale outline like a faded stamp. Places remember what mattered if you let your eyes learn to read the ghosts. I walked into the kitchen, and the slight echo told me something was missing. Our kitchen had always had a soft, cluttered sound because Helen believed rooms needed things that clinked and scraped to make a day feel like a day. There were new, sterile bar stools and a fruit bowl filled with glossy, fake lemons. But the table was the same. The table didn't lie. It held the grooves from two boys scraping their forks when broccoli was the only thing standing between them and dessert. It had the faint scorch mark from the time a model rocket toppled over and singed the corner, a secret nobody told me about until the Sunday sunlight found it first. You learn the truth of a family by the damage it decides to keep. A realtor's flyer sat in the center of the table like a confident, uninvited guest. Charming ranch for a young family. I didn't pick it up. I had no interest in reading about my own life described with adjectives that had never paid a mortgage. Instead, I stood still and listened. It's a trick I taught young architects on a job site when they thought they could fix a structural flaw with optimism. Stand still, I'd say. Let the building tell you what your eyes are refusing to see. The refrigerator hummed. The dishwasher had been run and left open, the top rack pulled out a few inches, like a tongue unsure of where to rest. On the counter, a neat pile of pens from a local mortgage lender sat perfectly aligned with the edge of the granite. I know the shape of a borrowed pen. It's the tool you're given before they start asking for answers. Memory walks in without knocking. I saw Caleb at 6, a smudge of pizza sauce on his cheek, insisting he could count to 100 without stopping if we just let him stay up late. I saw Liam at 10, memorizing the wiring diagram on the inside of a fuse box lid because he thought grown men were magicians and he wanted to learn the trick. I saw Helen at this very sink, washing a pie plate, telling me that the only thing we can really give our children is our time. Everything else, she'd said, is just packaging. She had dried her hands and pressed her palm flat against my sternum because she said it helped me listen better. Take care of them, Arthur. I told her I wouldn't lose track of which of us needed care at any given moment. She'd called me her stubborn soldier, with a grin that made the word a title I wanted to live up to. The house now felt like a stranger trying to pass as a distant relative. The old lamp with the chipped base was gone, replaced by a sleek, modern thing with a shade that would never tolerate a speck of dust. The corner where I kept my toolbox now held a decorative ladder with a single, perfectly folded blanket draped over one rung. A blanket meant to suggest comfort in a life where comfort had been swapped out for staging. I walked down the hall slowly, like a man learning a new gait, and stopped at the door to the room that had held a Christmas tree every December since we could afford one taller than a boy. The carpet still showed a faint circle where the tree stand used to be. I didn't step inside. Grief swings an axe in that room, and I decided to let it swing in the empty air this time. When you come home after days that started with hospital alarms, you don't need more drama, you need honesty. I opened the hall closet, where we stored coats, gloves, and the box of assorted batteries that never had the size you needed. My old winter jacket, the heavy one stained with a bit of furnace oil, sat folded on the top shelf. The scent of cedar and a hint of the garage still lived in its fibers. Someone had measured it for donation. A clear plastic bag sat beside it like a patient shopper. I took the jacket down and slid my arms into the sleeves. The familiar weight of it settled on my shoulders, and for a second I was back in a room where all four of us slept under a pile of blankets during a power outage, two small heads whispering secrets that drifted out of sleep and into a father's ears. This jacket wasn't for charity, it was for winter, and it was for keeping a promise to a version of myself that had carried sleeping boys across a room because their feet were cold. My phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I found the metal tin where Helen used to keep spare keys, bills to be paid, and the gold paper clips she swore had a better grip than the silver ones. Inside was the leather-bound ledger, where I wrote down every password I couldn't trust my memory to hold. The first page had Liam's name on it, drawn in a child's careful hand years ago when he was proud of teaching me how to combine letters and numbers in a way the bank would accept. He had drawn a small, lopsided smiley face next to his name. I looked at it and decided to let that little boy live. I could hold contempt and mercy in the same room as long as I kept the door open and the window cracked. Both get restless, both burn oxygen, both need supervision. I took the ledger and the compass and walked toward the bedroom. The bed had been stripped and remade with a comforter that didn't belong to us. It was a hotel bed, designed not to argue with anyone. On the dresser, a vase held dry branches that would never drop their leaves. Beside it, a manila folder lay open, as if someone had just stepped away. I didn't look inside. Not yet. The mirror over the dresser showed a man who had relearned the shape of his own jaw. My hair had thinned more than I'd realized, but my eyes hadn't lost their insistence. I've known men who fear seeing themselves at certain ages. I'm not one of them. My face is a ledger of its own, and it's been kept with decent care. I set the compass on the dresser. It ticked softly, like an old friend counting down the minutes until supper. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my shoulders settle. A cardinal called from the hedge outside, and for a second, I thought about how many mornings I had ignored that same call because my to-do list was longer than the coffee maker was fast. We don't learn what matters when life is generous. We learn it when we can't stand up without planning it first. The lessons that save you tend to be the ones you would have thrown away when you thought you were too busy. I heard footsteps in the hall. Not a stranger's heavy tread, but the careful shuffle of a son who knows which floorboards sigh. Liam stepped into the doorway, a paper coffee cup in his hand, his name scrawled on the side like a reminder to a barista who would forget him a minute later. He stopped short when he saw me. For a moment, his face cycled through three expressions: surprise, relief, then calculation. I stood and gave a slight nod, letting the silence do the work. He asked if I needed anything. I said I needed time. He looked down at the cup and said he could get groceries, bring in the mail, pick up paint samples. I said groceries would be useful. He said he could be back in an hour. He didn't meet my eyes as he turned to leave. The front door closed and the house started breathing in its new, strange rhythm again. Alone again. I opened the manila folder. I didn't rush. People who have been rushed by life don't owe speed back to it. The papers were laid out in an order meant to look like permission. Lists of assets, account numbers, signatures. I ran my finger over a raised notary seal and remembered a small medical procedure 2 years ago and the morphine haze that had made the world feel both kind and unreliable. Take care of them, Arthur, had played in my head then too. I had thought a signature was a helpful rope. I hadn't realized it could become a leash if the wrong hands held the other end. I closed the folder and put it under the dresser, not because I was afraid of it, but because heavy things shouldn't be left in plain sight. I walked to the den which used to hold my desk, a surface covered in blueprints, contracts, and photographs of bridges and retaining walls, the kinds of projects people drive over without ever thinking about who measured the rebar. The desk was gone. In its place, an accent chair sat with a pillow that advised me to relax. I smiled to myself, without humor. Relax is a word people throw at you when they want you to stop asking questions. I put my hand on the wall where the desk used to be and felt the faint ridge of paint that had been protected by the wood for all those years. The room remembered me. For now, that was enough. In the garage, the air changed again. It smelled of oil, grass clippings, and a summer that had ended 2 seasons ago. The lawn tools were propped against the wall like old soldiers awaiting orders. Someone had rearranged my wrenches in a way that made for a neat picture but no practical sense. I fixed them in 3 quick motions. Muscle memory remembers what the mind forgets when it's been busy surviving. On the workbench was a draft of a listing agreement with my name printed at the bottom. The signature line was blank, but the intent was clear. I didn't feed my anger. I set the paper aside like a piece of wood that could either become a step or kindling. Not every tool is for building. Some are for burning the bridges you should have never crossed in the first place. I wasn't ready to decide which this was yet. Back in the kitchen, I made tea. Coffee held a memory I didn't want to taste. While the kettle heated, I slid open the kitchen window and let the March air wander in. 2 boys were playing catch across the street, shouting each other's names with the certainty my sons once had, the certainty that the other would always answer. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet. Just a small shift, like moving a heavy chair an inch so a door can open all the way. Pain is a teacher if you stop treating it like an enemy. It will sit and tell you things if you just keep your voice low and your hands steady. I carried my mug to the table. Next to the realtor's flyer lay a key ring with a small rubber house attached, a promotional trinket from a lender. I rolled the soft rubber between my thumb and forefinger. It warmed, then cooled. I set it down and slid the flyer underneath the ledger. Some papers you keep on top to remind you. Others you put underneath because you're not here to decorate your grief. You're here to measure it and then decide how to use it. The late light does a specific thing in this house. It angles under the dining room arch and lands on a patch of floor that's been sanded and resealed twice since the boys were small. They learned to dance in that square of light on New Year's Eve, when Helen would make a playlist of songs from cars that had taken us to places we couldn't afford to stay. She taught them to let the downbeat hit their shoulders, sink to their knees, and laugh at their own awkwardness. The older they got, the more slowly they danced, until they stopped altogether, and the square on the floor went back to being just wood. I sat and let that square fill with memory. The house didn't argue. It offered up details, the way an old friend offers extra napkins at a picnic. The scent of the wood polish Helen used once a month, whether it was needed or not. The saucepan with a dent she refused to throw away because it had survived the time the cat knocked it off the stove. The front door closed with a solid thunk that you could hear all the way in the back bedroom. I felt the compass in my shirt pocket, took it out, and wound it one slow turn. The sound returned to the house, and to me, in a way I can't explain without asking you to sit very still and listen with me. Tick. It wasn't a command. It was a permission. When Liam came back with groceries, he stood by the door longer than a person needs to in March. He carried 2 paper bags and cleared his throat. I took one from him to keep his hands from shaking. We put things away without turning conversation into a contest. He asked if I liked the new paint. I said paint is only as honest as what it's covering. He nodded, the nod of a man who hears words that aren't loud and knows they're heavier than the ones he came prepared to say. He said Caleb would be by later. I said I would be resting. He said he understood, and the way he said it made me think he didn't, but he wanted to try. Sometimes the most generous gift you can give a man is a sentence he can take home and think about without losing face. I offered him one. We'll talk when we're both ready to listen. He took it like you take a wrench from someone who knows what size you need because they've worked on the same engine longer than you have. He left and I locked the door without ceremony. The sun slid lower and the light performed its last trick of the day, that moment when every surface becomes honest and every floor raises its hand. In that honesty, I sat in the chair by the window and let myself consider what I had been avoiding since the ICU. I had always believed that love plus effort equals family, that if you show up for the games, prioritize dinner, fix what breaks, and hold the line on lies, the math will work out. In that chair, I learned a new equation. Love plus effort plus boundaries equals dignity. Without the third element, you're just rearranging chairs on a boat that someone else is already rowing out to sea. I thought of men my age who call me from their garages and porches and quiet cars because they have stories that sound like mine. They talk about elder financial abuse and how it doesn't begin with money, but with entitlement. They want to know if there's a way to turn the tide without drowning their own names in court records. I tell them there's due process, and there are advocates, and there are certified letters, and there's community, and there's the law, and then there's something older than all of it. Your own decision to stop being processed. The room darkened. I stood and turned on the small lamp in the corner. The shade made the light warm, the way a candle can make a cheap meal taste like a promise. I walked back to the stack of frames and picked up the wedding photo again. I carefully slid the cracked glass out and brushed away the grit that had collected in the corner. I put the photo back in the frame, without the glass, and set it on the dresser where the compass could tick next to it. I had no interest in a perfect picture. I wanted the air to be able to touch her face. The hallway carried the sound of a car door, then voices. Liam and Caleb. They spoke in that tight, hushed way men do when they're trying to captain a sinking ship without letting the passengers smell the smoke. Their footsteps stopped at the front door. I didn't move to meet them, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I had learned that certain kinds of hope should not be rushed. I let my eyes find the square of light on the floor again. It had faded to a thin line, the kind of line that tells you it's time to either close the blinds or go out and stand in the fading warmth and be a person who knows how to end a day. I chose to stand by the window and watch my street find its evening. A dog decided the day had been offensive and told the sky all about it. A teenager on a skateboard outran something only he could see. An older neighbor took in his trash can with the dignity of a man who has decided to live long enough to attend the birthday of a grandchild who won't remember the cake, but will remember that a grandfather smiled with his whole face. I pressed the compass against my palm, letting its rhythm argue with the smaller, uncertain rhythms in my chest, and win. Helen would have stood beside me and made a list. She believed lists could domesticate storms. She would have written what we know, what we need, and who we are. I don't write lists much anymore. I build scaffolding. I take the weight off the damaged beam. I brace the wall, and I wait for the structure to cure. Men in my line of work know that rushing a cure is the same as building a collapse. So I stood, and I decided that this house would not be my trap, and it would not be my stage. It would be my witness. The moon took its place with a casual authority. The boys hadn't rung the bell. Maybe they were arguing on the porch. Maybe they were practicing apologies. Maybe they were making a new plan with the same old math. I turned from the window and walked back to the dresser, where the photo and the compass sat like two old friends who had earned the right to speak freely. I put my fingertips on the wood, closed my eyes, and said the only prayer I know that doesn't require words. I told the room the truth in silence. The past is beautiful when I let it be. The present is honest when I stop pretending. The future will be mine if I remember that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks, keys, and names. The light from the hallway slipped under the bedroom door in a bright stripe. I leaned down and picked up the jacket from the bed, putting it on again. The cloth hung right. It pulled my shoulders into a better alignment. I put the leather ledger in the inside pocket and the compass beside it. Time and memory tucked close to the place that had hurt and now held. I walked to the door and put my hand on the knob, the cool brass steadying me. I wasn't going to explain myself tonight. I was going to be myself. The house had changed its shape, and I had changed with it. That isn't a defeat. It's how a life keeps you from becoming a monument to a year nobody wants to visit. The light from the hallway slipped under the bedroom door in a bright stripe. I leaned down and picked up the jacket from the bed, putting it on again. The cloth hung right. It pulled my shoulders into a better alignment. I put the leather ledger in the inside pocket and the compass beside it. Time and memory tucked close to the place that had hurt and now held. I walked to the door and put my hand on the knob, the cool brass steadying me. I wasn't going to explain myself tonight. I was going to be myself. The house had changed its shape, and I had changed with it. That isn't a defeat. It's how a life keeps you from becoming a monument to a year nobody wants to visit. I knew I would need a lawyer, and I would need a plan, and I would need to remember that anger lights up a room but never warms it. I knew I would not be paying their bill for my own erasure anymore. I opened the door to the hallway, and the brightness made me squint. Somewhere near the entryway, the porch light clicked on because Liam had replaced the bulb last week and set the timer wrong. That small incompetence felt like a kindness, proof that even men who plot can still be human. I took a slow breath and let it out. The air moved through me like a promise I intended to keep. The compass ticked. The photo was without its glass. The staged sofa kept its angle. The new paint tried to act like history. The house and I had reached an agreement. We would tell the truth to each other, even if no one else wanted to hear it yet. And as the last of the daylight left the floor and the room settled into a deeper quiet, I understood the lesson that older men whisper to each other in parking lots and waiting rooms when no one else is listening. Beautiful memories turn betrayal into something sharper, yes, but they also turn you into a person who refuses to live on his knees. I had learned a long time ago that the real traps in life rarely look like cages. They look like invitations. They look like documents with neat margins and polite fonts. They look like pieces of paper that say power in one line and protection in another. That morning, sitting at the edge of my own bed in a house that no longer breathed in rhythm with me, I opened the manila folder I had pushed aside the night before. I had expected bills, maybe a contractor's estimate, maybe nothing at all. What I found was worse. There it was. A stack of papers topped with bold letters that read, "Power of Attorney." My name was printed cleanly across the header. My signature was scrawled at the bottom. I ran my finger across the raised seal of a notary who had probably thought he was witnessing nothing more than a father giving his sons a small rope of help. The memory came back with the weight of a sedative. That small surgery 2 years earlier, the morphine still fogging the edges of my thoughts. Liam leaning over me, his voice careful, the way a son's voice gets when he wants his father's hand to move without asking questions. "Just for insurance, Dad, just a precaution." That was the story he told me. My hand had trembled. The signature bore the shaky tale of a man trying to trust what he should have questioned. I let the paper rest on my lap. The page didn't shout. It whispered. And that whisper said more than anger ever could. On its own, it was just a form. But in the hands of sons eager to move faster than the beat of their father's heart, it was a crowbar. It pried open the lock to every choice I thought was still mine to make. I carried the folder to the kitchen table. The house was quiet, except for the low whine of the refrigerator. I laid the papers out one by one, like evidence on a courtroom table. Medical decisions, financial decisions, sale of property. The list marched on. My signature stared back at me like a witness I couldn't discredit. Every right I thought I had guarded with stubbornness had been transferred in one afternoon when painkillers had blurred my defenses. I thought of the years I spent teaching young architects that measurements were not suggestions. An inch overlooked today would become a cracked foundation tomorrow. And here I was, a man who prided himself on precision, staring at his own name signed on the dotted line without a clear memory of agreeing. Precision undone by trust. That was the cruelest measurement of all. Liam came in from the porch with the sound of a man trying to appear casual. His coffee cup was still steaming. He stopped when he saw the papers spread across the table. His eyes moved too quickly, like a person searching for an exit in a room with only one door. He set the cup down and cleared his throat. "Dad, we were only trying to be practical. Bills needed to be paid. The hospital was expensive. We didn't want to burden you." I looked at him and let the silence do the talking. Practical. That was the word he chose, and it sat between us like a well-dressed thief. Practicality has done more harm in this world than outright malice. It wears a tie, it smiles, it tells you everything is under control while moving the furniture out from under your life. Liam shifted his weight. His fingers tapped the cup. He said it again, softer this time, as if repetition could turn it into truth. It was just practical. I thought about Helen in our first years together, when we had to stretch every dollar until it begged for mercy. She told me once that practicality was fine when it came to buying potatoes, but it should never decide the shape of your family. I almost smiled, thinking of that. Almost. I gathered the papers back into the folder and closed it. The flap made a dull sound, heavier than paper should. A trap doesn't slam shut loudly. It settles. I slid the folder to the far edge of the table. Not hidden, just set aside for later, like lumber I would cut when the saw blade was sharper. Liam asked if I was angry. Anger is cheap. It spends itself too fast and leaves you empty when you need strength the most. I told him I needed to rest. He nodded too quickly, a man grateful to leave a courtroom without a sentence. He said he'd check in later, maybe bring something for dinner. His footsteps moved down the hall and out the front door. The house exhaled in relief. I reached for the leather ledger in my jacket pocket. The cover was worn smooth from years of use. Inside were the passwords, the accounts, the details I had always protected. Liam's lopsided smiley face was on the first page, drawn years ago. That boy was gone now, replaced by a man who thought a parent was inventory to be managed. But the ledger was still mine. My hand still wrote in it. My control lived there, in ink no one could forge. I thought of David, the nurse in the ICU, telling me I had scared everyone. He didn't know he was wrong. The people who should have been afraid of losing me were busy booking ocean view rooms. The only person who was truly scared in that hospital was me, staring at a note that said, Bahamas. Fear isn't a weakness when it teaches you who to trust. The folder on the table was a reminder that betrayal doesn't always come with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in tidy paragraphs and notarized seals. It comes in the name of efficiency. It comes dressed as common sense. And that's the kind you have to watch most closely. I stood and walked to the living room. The stack of framed photos still sat on the floor. I picked up another one, a picture of Caleb at his high school graduation. He stood tall, his cap crooked, a grin splitting his face. I remembered the way he'd looked at me that day, like I had built the stage just for him. I had clapped until my palms hurt. I had believed that if a man shows up, his sons will remember. I set the photo back down, the glass reflecting the room that had been staged for strangers. I sat in the chair that was angled toward the blank wall and thought about how betrayal often hides in the smallest print. Men my age know this better than most. We've signed mortgages, insurance policies, and contracts with clauses tucked into the margins. We know how easy it is to miss the one line that costs you everything. That's why I kept the ledger. That's why I always read things twice. And that's why I wouldn't let one fogged afternoon erase a lifetime of vigilance. The house was quiet, too quiet. I could hear the clock in the hallway ticking in time with the compass in my pocket. Tick, tick, 2 rhythms, one fragile, one steady. I stood, slid the folder into the top drawer of my nightstand and locked it. Then I placed the ledger on top of the nightstand where my hand could find it. Symbols matter. A locked drawer told me the trap was real. A ledger told me the way out still belonged to me. When men talk about betrayal, they often picture violence or shouting. But the deepest betrayal comes dressed as reason. A son said it was just practical. A signature gathered in a haze. A document folded neatly into a drawer. That's the betrayal that cuts deepest, because it convinces you for a moment that you agreed to your own erasure. I stood by the window as the sun shifted across the street. Children laughed in a yard. A dog barked, and life continued without ceremony. I realized then that my revenge would not come in anger. It would come with patience. It would come in reading every line, storing every piece of evidence, and letting practicality reveal itself as the fraud it really was. I pressed the compass into my palm until its edges marked my skin. Time has always been the only inheritance that matters. Helen was right about that. My sons could forge my name, but they couldn't forge my heartbeat. They couldn't forge the way time keeps its own record. As the light faded, I closed the blinds and sat again at the kitchen table. The folder was hidden now, but not forgotten. Betrayal doesn't vanish when you put it in a drawer. It waits. And so would I. With a compass, a ledger, and a patience that no one had counted on. Because the most dangerous man isn't the one who shouts. It's the one who waits quietly, measuring every inch until the day comes when the truth itself is too heavy to ignore. And that day had already begun. The first time the iPad lit up on the counter, I almost ignored it. Habit told me that blinking screens belong to younger men, not to fathers who still wrote reminders in spiral notebooks. But habit had already betrayed me once, when I'd signed without reading, when I'd trusted without checking. So I reached across the counter and brushed the edge of the screen with my knuckles. The glass flared to life, and in that moment I learned that betrayal has many dialects. Sometimes it's a forged signature, sometimes it's silence by your hospital bed, and sometimes it's a message delivered in clean sans serif letters. The subject line read, "House goes on the market Monday. If Dad isn't home, start placement intake." The sender was Megan. No greeting, no pretense. Just business. Written in the tone of someone scheduling a car service or ordering patio furniture. Intake. That word lodged itself in me like a splinter. Hospitals talk about intake. Insurance adjusters talk about intake. Strangers who process strangers use that word. Not family, not blood, not a daughter-in-law who once kissed my cheek on Christmas and told me she was grateful for the way I'd taught Caleb to be steady. I read the sentence again, slower this time. If Dad isn't home. The words assumed my absence as casually as the weather assumes rain will fall. Not a question, not a check-in, a declaration dressed as logistics. The iPad glowed in the dim kitchen like a witness with no loyalty. It showed me the truth without caring whether I wanted it. I stood there for a long time, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Practical, that was Liam's word. Intake, that was Megan's. Each colder than the one before. Betrayal wears layers, like winter clothing. The deeper you peel, the colder it gets. I set the iPad down and pressed both hands flat against the counter. The stone was cool and indifferent. My reflection ghosted back at me from the black edge of the screen. A man who had survived 9 seconds of nothingness, only to return to a family that spoke about him in intake forms. That irony should have broken me. Instead, it steeled me. That night, the house was still. Too still. Liam had left with his coffee cup. Caleb wasn't back yet. The blinds were half open, letting in a square of streetlight that spread across the floor like a warning. I sat at the table, the iPad still glowing, the folder with the power of attorney locked away but never out of reach, the ledger beside me like a heartbeat I could control. Around midnight, I heard the faint sound of a door hinge, the kind that only complains when someone tries too hard to be quiet. Footsteps, a low voice, Caleb's voice, muffled by the half wall between the den and the kitchen. He was on the phone. I caught the shape of his words, even if the walls tried to hold them. He said the word stabilized. He said, conscious now. He said, I thought you might want to know. And then a pause, long enough to taste the rejection on the other end. Finally, he sighed through his nose, the way Helen used to when a recipe burned. The phone clicked against its cradle. I closed my eyes and pictured him in the ICU hallway, speaking in that same low tone, hoping the other end of the line would carry relief, only to find disinterest. I wondered who he had called. Liam, most likely. Maybe Megan. Whoever it was, they had paused long enough to send a message clearer than any sentence. My survival was an inconvenience. I leaned back in the chair and let the silence rush back in after the call. The machines in the ICU had sung to me once. Now the house sang its own song. The heater clicked. The refrigerator cycled. A faint ticking came from the hallway clock. Each sound said what the people closest to me had refused to. You are still here. In the morning, the email remained on the screen like a stain. I read it once more. If Dad isn't home. The word home cut sharper than intake. They weren't just moving me into a facility, they were moving me out of myself, out of the rooms Helen had painted with her own hands, out of the grooves in the dining table carved by boys who once believed their father could fix anything, out of the only proof left that I had been more than an entry on a hospital chart. The pace of that morning slowed to a crawl. I made coffee, and it tasted metallic, like hospital air. I buttered toast and chewed without tasting. I sat at the table and stared at the square of light on the rug until it shifted and moved to a different room, aging with the hours. Betrayal has a way of distorting time. Seconds stretch, minutes crawl. You count them not to measure the day, but to remind yourself you're still the one doing the counting. Liam came in late that morning with a bag of groceries. He set them on the counter and asked if I wanted cereal or eggs. His tone was careful. The way men speak when they sense the ground beneath them has changed, but they don't yet know why. I told him eggs were fine. He busied himself at the stove, his back turned, as though cooking for me could erase the word intake. I said nothing. Silence is heavier than anger when it's used correctly. He filled the air with small sentences about the weather, about a neighbour's new car, about how Caleb's flight had been delayed again. He didn't mention the iPad. He didn't mention the email. He slid a plate in front of me with hands that shook more than a hot pan could justify. I picked up my fork and took one bite. The eggs were overcooked. That wasn't the betrayal. That was just life. But the silence between us was a canyon, and he knew it. He asked if I wanted him to stay. I said no. He left with his head low. When the door shut, I pushed the plate away. Hunger wasn't the ache in me. Loss was. Not the loss of food or comfort or even the house itself. The loss of recognition, the loss of the bond that should have stopped a sentence like start placement intake before it was ever typed. I carried the iPad to the bedroom and placed it beside the compass. 2 symbols from different eras. One ticked faithfully, carrying memory in every swing of its needle. The other lit up with cold letters that reduced a father to a file, past and present side by side, both true, both mine to decide what to do with. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the blinds, I walked through the house again. The staged sofa, the pale rectangle on the wall, the faint ring in the carpet where a tree once stood. Each detail told me the same thing. They had already begun erasing me. The email wasn't the start. It was the confirmation. I stopped in the guest room, half-staged for a realtor's photograph. 3 donation bags leaned against the wall. I pulled one open. My jacket, the one Helen bought me the winter the furnace broke, stared back at me, folded neatly, tagged for removal. Intake for my clothes, intake for my house, intake for my life. They were processing me, piece by piece. I closed the bag and sat on the bed. The springs creaked under my weight. I pressed the compass against my chest and listened. Its tick was steady. My breath followed it. Intake might have been their word, but survival was mine. The lesson settled in quietly, the way wisdom often does for men my age. Family isn't defined by who shares your name. It's defined by who shares your silence when that silence weighs more than words. Megan's email had told me what I needed to know. My sons had traded a father for a liability. My daughter-in-law had traded respect for efficiency. They had turned blood into casework. And I realized then that my revenge would not be about rage. Rage burns too fast. My revenge would be about patience, about evidence, about letting their own words hang in the air until even they couldn't deny them. Intake would not be my ending. It would be the beginning of a record. That night, as the house settled into its quiet rhythm, the iPad chimed again. Another notification. The sound was sharp against the silence, like a gavel in a courtroom. I didn't reach for it right away. I let it ring out into the dark kitchen. The glow spread across the counter like a flare, illuminating every corner of a room that had once held laughter and now held judgment. I finally picked it up. Another email, short, to the point, from Megan again. We will need to talk about the accounts. Accounts, intake, practical. Each word stacked like a brick in a wall I hadn't asked for. But walls can be climbed, and I had time. More time than they believed. I set the iPad down beside the compass and the ledger. 3 symbols, 3 weapons, time, truth, and patience. The room dimmed around me, but those 3 glowed steadily. When I finally lay down to sleep, the last thing I heard was not the hum of machines or the ring of notifications. It was the compass, ticking faithfully, reminding me that as long as it moved, I had not yet been reduced to intake. And in that quiet, I promised myself, They will learn the difference between paperwork and a man who refuses to be processed. End of story.